In this video we'll show the last thing that you really need to be familiar with when using the export rig with Rigit, and that is of course how to export the thing. There are a couple of things that we need to do, namely we need to get the bones for our character baked. We need to bake their animation. We also need them to belong to the character mesh, not this export skeleton null, and we need to get rid of all the unnecessary junk. And of course we need to have some animation. Now you will notice here that I've maintained a base pose on frame 0. My animation begins at 1. This is generally a good idea most of the time in Lightwave, especially when you're going to be needing to swap out bones from one mesh item to a different one, just in case you wind up with an error and you need to re-rest to rebind them. That has to be done at base pose. You can work these things in a couple of different orders, but I'll show you my preferred order. The first thing I'm going to do is bake all of this lot. So, I'll select all bones of the current object, which gives me all of these bones. I'll then bake my animation, for which I'm going to use the RH Motion Baker, which has been designed pretty much for this specific purpose. The options are pretty straightforward: a start, a stop, a step, frames per second that you're baking at. If you don't want to bake at the current scene frames per second, you can make the curves linear or TCB. Since we're looking to export, linear is what we're going to want, and we have these filter and reduce keys options, which for the minute I'm going to turn off. So I've got my range there, 0 to 160, hit OK, and Lightwave will chug through, and when it's done, everything has been baked down to keyframes. So that's pretty good. Now if we take a look at a given bone here in Graph Editor, we can see that, for instance, for the forearm, I've got all of these basically do nothing keys going on in some of these channels, the position, the scale channels. If you're going to a game engine, then this is bad because these keyframes are data and they're going to be using up memory. So what you want, of course, is to take out all of these nonsense keyframes. You'll also notice that, for instance here, even in one of my rotation channels, which does need keying, I do have a plateau, which I could really do with reducing. So that's what we use the reduce keys method for. So I can just bake again here, that's fine. And so there we go, with all of my bones baked again, but you can notice these keyframes have been reduced, so only those that have a motion within the threshold value actually now contain key data. So we've got much cleaner set of curves for exporting. The other thing that you really do not want to have happening on your skeleton is for there to be any Euler flips going on, which, as it turns out, in this animation and this character I don't have. A good way to check for them is just to turn on fractional keyframes as I have here and scrub gently through. You will see bones spinning around and going a bit mental. That is an Euler flip. But again, we can fix that inside the Motion Baker by using the filter keys, which will apply an Euler filter to the keyframes. The one note when using this, you'll notice how I have a base pose here at 0, and then of course at frame 1 we snap straight into the first animation pose. This sudden jump between the two may well confuse the Euler filter, and certainly if your character turns round or a limb is posed usually beyond 90 degrees, this will confuse the Euler filter. So when you use the Motion Baker with the filter keys turned on, do not bake from your base pose. Begin at the first frame of your animation. In this case, that's frame 1. With that done, you'll have a properly filtered, baked skeletal motion. All nice, all happy so far. So what we want to do then is we want these bones to belong to the actual character mesh. You can just parent them across, that's fine. The other alternative is to take the export skeleton null here, simply replace it with your character mesh. You can then of course get rid of that first copy of the mesh. It is of course working exactly the same. So we now just want to isolate this, so we can just drag it up to unparent it, make it a scene child. We could of course gone into the motion options here and just set the parent item to none. We want then to get rid of all of the actual rig because that's no longer needed. We just need the bones. Easiest way is just to select all objects, deselect, obviously, the character mesh itself, clear absolutely everything, yes to all, yes to all. That leaves us with just the mesh and the bones. This is obviously skinned just fine. So I can now, of course, select all of the bones, delete that base pose for them, and we have just an animation on the bones, nothing else. From this point we just export it using whatever exporter we're using. If we're going to Unity, for example, then we would just use the good old standard FBX exporter that's built into Lightwave. If you're going to some other game engine that had its own exporter and you had an exporter plugin for, you would just use that. And that basically is it. Your animation is baked, filtered, and ready to be exported to your game engine with all of your deforms done and working. And that's basically it. That is the Rigit export skeleton, more or less start to finish.